Welcome to the Neurostimulation Podcast. I'm Michael Passmore, Clinical Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. The Neurostimulation Podcast is all about exploring the world of neuroscience and clinical neurostimulation, how it works, the latest research breakthroughs, and how that research is being translated into real-world treatments that can improve health and well-being. This podcast is separate from my clinical and academic roles and is part of my personal effort to bring neuroscience education to the general public, free of charge. Accordingly, I would like to emphasize that the information shared in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice or a substitute for professional medical guidance. Today's episode is presented by ZipStim Neurostimulation. Full disclosure, ZipStim is the neurostimulation clinic that I own and operate. You can find out more about our clinical neurostimulation programs at zipstim.com. That's ZIPSTIM.com. Today I'm really looking forward to a discussion with Douglas Mulhall. Douglas is a science journalist, researcher, and author of Discovering the Nature of Longevity, a groundbreaking book on how hidden stress silently erodes our health and how new therapies are turning the tide. With a foreword by Columbia University's Chief of Cardiology and a recommendation from the American Institute of Stress, Douglas brings to life little-known but deeply relevant topics like why elastin proteins and not collagen are key to vitality, and how reversing arterial damage is helping patients to avoid amputations and aneurysms. He joins us today from Canada's East Coast to share his expertise on elastin and the impact of elastin on aging and various health problems.
Hello, everybody. My name is Douglas Mulhall, and I'm here to present to you today this presentation, which is called Restoring the Elastic of Life, ? And you'll see why the question mark is there as we go through the presentation. Elastin fiber from a bird's eye view. The reason I put that in is because this is really a general introduction to elastin fiber. It's not very technical, but the reason that we're doing it this way is because actually a lot of patients and even a lot of medical experts might have heard something remotely about elastin, but quite often don't have the faintest idea what it actually does. And so this is a beginning introduction to that, call it Elastin for Dummies. And we might in future presentations delve into some of the more specific conditions that surround elastin fiber. So without further ado, there is a really important thing that everybody who deals with elastin has to understand, and that is the nomenclature, because there's a lot of confusion about it, and you'll see why. First of all, there's the ELN gene that actually codes for elastin protein. This is where the whole thing gets started, and that's happening, of course, inside the cell. Then there is a precursor to elastin protein and elastin fiber, which is called tropoelastin. And this is one of the key building blocks. It's also used in therapy, as we'll get to later. Then there is actually the elastin protein itself, which comes out of this assembly process from tropoelastin and other substances. And finally, and the main topic of the presentation today, there is the elastin fiber, which is a very sophisticated combination of elastin precursors in the extracellular matrix, which I'll talk about in a moment. And these come together with microfibrils and other substances to weave into this extremely flexible, extremely tough, and long-lived elastin fiber. The problem in the literature is that even in some of the best scientific publications about it, they use elastin for short to refer to one or several of these. So when you're reading through some of the literature, it's just important to understand that there are at least these 4 aspects when we're referring to elastin. And so when I refer to elastin here, mostly I'm going to be talking about the fiber and in some cases the protein. So everyone's familiar with the collagen. It's, of course, in volume far more plentiful than elastin, but they are closely connected cousins. And together, they do really some miraculous things in the body. So I just thought I'd give a brief introduction to how they fit together. First of all, collagen provides strength and firmness. This is the most important thing about collagen. But elastin provides the flexibility, the recoil, and the support for tissue. And these 2 things together are what make up most of the extracellular matrix that connects almost everything in the body. And they are referred to variously as fascia, the interstitium, and a connective tissue, all of which are slightly different, but they're basically made up of similar components that I just described. And by the way, a couple of years ago, the interstitium was named an organ in the body, and actually the body's largest organ. So you can see how pervasive the role of this collagen and elastin mix is in the body. So elastin fiber, you can see here on the left-hand side, this is actual elastin fiber that is a bovine sample. And that's the stuff that stretches and recoils. It makes up anywhere between 0.5% and 70% of most connective tissues. And I'll get to the details in a moment. But what you're looking at here is basically the elastin protein, and it has a really miraculous quality. And that is that it can expand and contract to 8 times its standing length in a fraction of a second, billions of times in a lifetime without any turnover. Its half-life is 70 years. And so this makes it one of the toughest and most unusual tissues in the human body. So elastin is in so many places in the body and plays a fundamental role. In the arteries, especially the larger arteries, it is between 5 and 50%, especially around the aorta. There's a large amount of elastin there, which is crucial, as I'll explain later. Heart valves, about 10 to 15%, again, a critical aspect. And it's interesting because one side of heart valves has less elastin and one side has more elastin, which actually explains why heart valves stop working. And I'll get to that in a moment. Pulmonary, lungs, between 3 and 17%. And most critically, it is found in the air sacs. And that's what allows the air sacs to expand and contract to get the oxygen in and out of the body. Muscle connective tissue, more or less 15%. But what's interesting is that when you look at the literature, it says there's really not that much elastin in muscle, but actually elastin is critical for muscular function because there are tiny strings of it that are actually connecting the different muscle fibers that allow muscle to expand and contract. If that elastin wasn't there, they wouldn't be able to do that. The eyes have it. And it's interesting because it's all throughout the eye. It's especially in the trabecular meshwork that controls intraocular pressure. So it's a key player in controlling eye pressure. But it's also in the sclera, and perhaps most importantly, it surrounds the optic nerve, and it protects the optic nerve from variations in intraocular pressure. So it's a very small amount, but it plays critical roles, and it's also a big player in disease, as we'll see later. Tendons, 1 to 3%, but a critical 1 to 3% because tendons and ligaments could not extend and contract without elastin fiber. and variously in the stomach, the lining of the stomach, the bladder, the bowel, and reproductive organs. And I can't emphasize enough that none of these organs would be able to function without elastin fiber, which, when you think of it, explains a lot about why we start having problems with our organs later in life. This is a major factor here, is elastin fiber. And to be clear, it's in the wall of the artery in the medial layer. That is where the elastin fiber is found, which, as we'll see later, explains why calcification happens in the medial layer. Healthy elastin can stretch and recoil, and degraded elastin frays. Now, all of that is fine as long as your body is producing elastin fiber, because then you can replace it. But most of the elastin fiber in your body is actually generated when you're a child, and more does come along in your teens, but then it starts to just not happen anymore. And that's the problem. The body stops assembling elastin fiber when you get into your late 20s. The world's top experts cannot explain why. All the experts who are developing therapies for this, I've asked them, and it's something that's programmed into us. And the big problem with that is that after the body stops assembling elastin, and I want to emphasize, it's interesting because the building blocks of elastin fiber continue to be produced, but they don't assemble in the extracellular matrix. And that's when the trouble starts, because there's nothing to replace the elastin fiber when it is injured and damaged. So it starts falling apart. It starts falling apart slowly and causing a lot of trouble that you don't really realize until later in life. So elastin degrades in absolutely everyone. And you can see here these nice, smooth tendrils of elastin in a 5-year-old, and then this mess of frayed, stiff elastin in a 90-year-old. And I think this is one of the best visual representations of why we get stiff. So that brings us to the patient. How elastin affects the patient and is affected by the patient. And one thing to emphasize is that the modifiable risk factors that affect elastin are in many ways similar to cardiovascular risks, modifiable risk factors. Not all of them, but many of them are, which again explains why you have these problems developing after the age of 30 with cardiovascular system. So stress, all kinds of stress, emotional stress, toxic stress, repetitive stress injuries, all of those things contribute to degrading elastin fiber. Smoking and wildfire smoke is a big problem for elastin fiber because it contains a lot of heavy metals that are particularly bad for it. Poor diet, too much junk food, red meat and dairy products tend to be pro-inflammatory. So anything that promotes an inflammatory cycle in the body, any type of food, is going to cause oxidative stress that damages elastin. If you drink too much, it's going to cause a problem. Elastin doesn't like too much alcohol. Any carcinogen, again, generates this oxidative stress that causes this damage. Injuries, and injuries include, by the way, surgical scars. So, and any kind of scar, because scarring happens largely because the elastin fiber is completely destroyed when it's wounded, when you cut into it. And that's why when you get the healing, the scar is tough because the elastin is basically destroyed. Radiation. So astronauts in space, one of the reasons that many of them start to have cardiovascular problems is because radiation is knocking bits and pieces off of the elastin fiber and promoting an inflammatory cascade. Shear stress. Shear stress is oddly enough, the physical stress of red blood cells bumping along the side of the artery. And this shear stress actually creates micro injuries that are constantly being healed and repaired in the artery, except when we start to get older. Heavy metals is a big one. For those of you who might not be aware, heavy metals such as lead, cadmium, and chromium, I believe, were declared last year by the American Heart Association to be a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It's the first time that an environmental factor has actually been listed as a cardiovascular risk. And part of that is because of the damage that they do to elastin fiber. And finally, infection. But not just any infection, but low-grade infection that often escapes notice when testing is done. Anything from gingivitis to any type of very low chlamydia, for example, is another example. Some things which are not tested for and are there at very low levels. Helicobacter pylori, which is the cause of stomach ulcers, and many of us are infected with it. We just don't get the ulcers. So all of these infections have an impact on elastin fiber and COVID. So COVID attacks the lining of the arteries. And that is a major reason why so many people who were hospitalized or died from COVID had cardiovascular problems. And it's a major reason why some people who had severe COVID went on to develop cardiovascular problems because it attacks the lining of the artery, and that's where the elastin is found. So those are some of the examples. Now, if you're trying to say to a patient, if you're trying to explain to them what is elastin fiber, I always do something called the pinch test. And actually, anybody can do it right now who's watching or listening. What you do is you take the skin between your thumb and your forefinger, and you hold it up for about 5 seconds, and then you let it go. And if you're young, it'll snap right back. If you're older, it'll go down more slowly. And if you're very old, it doesn't go down at all. It just stays up there. That is not the collagen in your skin. That is principally the elastic fiber. The cosmetics companies would have you think that it's collagen because they've figured out how to fix collagen more or less, or there are some things that they can do to improve it. Not so with elastin. So that's why until very recently, they haven't been talking about it that much. For patients, why do we get wrinkles? Once again, as I said, cosmetics manufacturers are happy to tell patients that collagen is responsible for wrinkling. But the reason we wrinkle is because we lose the elasticity in our skin. So yes, collagen has something to do with that if you're losing the firmness, but it's principally the elastin that causes this wrinkling. Same internally. The bladder, one of the major reasons why people have to pee more frequently as they get older is because the bladder wall stiffens. And that bladder wall, as you can see at the inset, has got elastin fiber in it. And that is what allows the bladder to expand and contract so easily. So you can imagine when elastin gets damaged and starts to harden, what happens to your ability to pee? Whoops, sorry. Back we go. This is a really interesting one. There's all kinds of reasons that are given for blood pressure increasing. It all comes down to vascular stiffening. But that stiffening is often attributed to plaque, for example. But quite often, before the plaque ever comes along and calcifies and stiffens, in the medial layer of the artery, the elastin gets damaged, and you get a cascade that I'll talk about in a moment that leads to fibrosis, stiffening, and calcification of the medial layer, which results in hypertension. So Yes, it's a major contributor to hypertension. So here's the sequence that happens. After healthy elastin is no longer replaced, all of these antagonists damage it. And when elastin is damaged, it actually lets out a bunch of substances that call to the immune cells and say, help me, I need to be fixed. And so you get this inflammatory response. And so the cells release all these inflammatory substances, cytokines, et cetera, and they go and they clean up the mess. But if the elastin isn't being replaced anymore, this becomes a vicious cycle, because the more that they clean it away, the more that the inflammation is caused, because nothing is actually cross-linking the elastin to repair it. So after a couple of years of this going on, the body goes to plan B. And plan B is to do what the body does quite well for certain injuries, and that is to wall off the offender. For example, I froze my earlobe when I was skiing many years ago, and the body actually surrounded the frozen dead tissue with a calcified wall, and eventually it kicked it out. So it just popped out of my ear. So these types of cysts are very useful, except there's a problem when it comes to your vascular system and your organs. That doesn't work very well to wall them all off, but that's exactly what the body tries to do. In fact, it appears to be a defect in our immune response. Our immune system, unlike the immune systems of certain species of whale and shark that live to be 350 years, hasn't quite figured out the mechanisms by which these longer term insults can be dealt with effectively. And so it tries the same short-term stuff. And the result of that ultimately is that it tries to wall it off with calcification. And in fact, elastin is the site of these tiny little nanometer-sized calcification crystals that are brought to the site by membrane vesicles, exosomes. So the cells emit these calcifying exosomes. They go to the site of the damaged elastin. They release these micro calcifications, which at that point are just crystals, and then they start to aggregate. And that's when you start to get calcification. And this does not show up on any scans until it starts to get really big. So the process starts at a very young age. Autopsies of young people who died in war, for example, show that these streaks, these fatty streaks on the artery, show up very early in life, but they just aren't detected. So this, I think, is a very nice representation of what happens when you end up with elastin gone bad. And all the white stuff that you see there is calcification of the arteries. This is actually a 3D image of an actual calcified artery. The other way that calcification occurs is it does occur as plaque builds up in the arteries. These two things, the calcification of the medial layer and the calcification in the plaque in the arteries, seem to be different mechanisms, but you get the same thing. In the plaque, you get the formation of calcified nodes that destabilize the plaque. And those calcified nodes are actually coming from damaged elastin fragments that are released from the artery wall into the plaque in an attempt to repair the elastin there. So again, it's this vicious cycle. Okay, you can see from that there's a whole bunch of medical conditions that elastin is associated with. On the cardiovascular, you've got hypertension, aneurysms, stroke, arterial sclerosis, and heart failure. Also heart valves, as I mentioned earlier. Pulmonary, COPD, emphysema, PAH. Kidneys, CKD, incontinence, as I mentioned earlier. Vision loss. Damaged elastin is, you can see it actually in age-related macular degeneration and in glaucoma, especially in glaucoma around the optic nerve. You can see that the elastin has been knocked off it. Injury and wound scarring, as I mentioned earlier, skin aging, and cancer progression. The substances known as elastin-derived particles are called EDPs, and EDPs have been shown to promote the rapid growth of tumors, which is very interesting when you think about it. Damaged elastin is actually very closely associated with the progression of cancer. And there is some evidence that cancer actually promotes the partial formation of incomplete elastin fibers and then breaks them down to feed on the resulting byproducts. It's an ingenious survival tactic, but not many people are aware of this, even though there's quite a few papers published about it. So we get to prevention and treatment. First of all, as I described, you can easily explain elastin fiber to your patients just with the pinch test. You can tell them that the same modifiable risk factors that are associated with cardiovascular disease also delay the degradation of elastin fiber. So there is something that they can do. Treatment is still at a very early stage. It is coming fast, but really it has taken at least 30 years to figure out how to restore elastin fiber. And I'm just going to describe a couple of examples of that. Right now in clinical trial, there is a technique that was developed by Professor Tony Weiss's team at the University of Sydney in Australia, and they have developed tropoelastin scaffolds. I know I put elastin there, but in this case, the elastin comes along later for wound and skin repair. And what they do is, I'll just show you the mechanism of action here in a minute. So this is what a tropoelastin scaffold looks like, which is electrospun. It doesn't have the tropoelastin on it yet. So electrospun scaffolds are not just used for populating with tropoelastin, they're also used for populating with cells, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an established technology. The mechanism of action works something like this. You get the scaffold, which is electrospun from a solution. Then the tropoelastin, the scaffolds are seeded with tropoelastin, and they're applied to the wound bed where they integrate with the tissue and they accelerate the wound healing process. And what that does is it absolutely minimizes scarring. So it's also being used, for example, to eliminate scarring from acne. So the way it works is the tropoelastin releases these peptides that attract other cells for wound healing, promote angiogenesis as well. So this contributes to the elasticity of the new tissue. So that is a very bird's eye view of how a very complicated process works. Now, there's another one. Elastin is comprised, as I mentioned earlier, of this elastin core, elastin fiber core, and then it's wrapped in these microfibrils. And these microfibrils help it expand and contract horizontally, but they also get damaged by all of the antagonists that I mentioned earlier. This is the one on the top is healthy, the one on the top is damaged. And so this is actually what's going on inside the human body. The result of that is that the exposed elastin fiber has a particular protein signature that it displays when the microfibrils are knocked off of it. And this is a unique therapeutic target. So in 2007, researchers led by Dr. Naren Vivahari at Clemson University in South Carolina discovered, and the way that they discovered this is Dr. Vivahari was trying to understand why one side of a heart valve calcifies and the other side doesn't. And when he did the biochemical analysis of it, he found out that the elastin content in one side of the valve is much higher than the other. And it was the side that gets the higher percentage of elastin that actually calcifies. So from there, he started doing a bunch of in vitro experiments to try and figure out how to decalcify it. And he went through dozens and dozens of chemicals, but he had heard that tannins can be effective in restoring some tissues. He went through the tannins, and the reason that you see this picture on the right is because one of the tannins is something called pentagalloyl glucose, or PGG for short, and it is derived from the rind of the pomegranate fruit. The next time I don't know, have any of you taken apart a pomegranate, but you tend to take the seeds out and then throw out the rind. Don't throw it out. Eat it because it's full of PGG. That's where it's found. But it's also found in tree bark. It's found in grapes. It's found in some vegetables. Primarily, it's just its highest concentration is in just a few plants. It's naturally derived polyphenol, extracted from plants, and it conserves elastin. That conservation of elastin allows the body to kickstart the reassembly process. So the PGG appears not to itself restore the elastin, but rather conserve it in a way that allows the body to then assemble what it has stopped assembling, because all the building blocks are there. So the really promising thing that's gone on is that in a phase 1 clinical trial, aortic aneurysms were stabilized. Now, for those of you who have any familiarity, and I'm sure most people watching this do, with aortic aneurysms, you will know that they threaten the lives of more than 10 million people in North America alone, and they can burst at any time. So the patient is living in fear of this. And when they reach 5 millimeters in size, you have to take fairly risky surgery, although the surgery is being improved, but it can be life-threatening, and it doesn't always work. So these aneurysms are a real problem until now. So this phase 1 clinical trial actually succeeded in stabilizing aneurysms, and the therapy, which was developed by Nectaro Medical, also based on Dr. Vivahari's work at Clemson University, it was sublicensed from Clemson to Nectaro Medical. That is now being used, and the phase 2-3 clinical trial is currently underway, and I believe that they're still recruiting patients, even though the trial is ongoing. Anyone who knows someone who has an aneurysm that they're concerned about should definitely look into the recruitment of this clinical trial. So here's how it works, basically. You've got a balloon catheter it's a specialized balloon catheter that seals off the artery at both ends for about 10 minutes, and then it inserts the PGG. And so the wall of the artery gets a good exposure to the PGG, after which the catheter is removed. So there's no permanent invasiveness. It's a pretty standard procedure, but the balloon catheter, which is called the bullfrog catheter, is actually a very specialized one. There's actually 2 catheters that are used. PGG has this high affinity for elastin. It sticks to it, and it inhibits all of the elastases, the enzymes and the MMPs, everything that attacks elastin fiber. It inhibits those processes. And as I mentioned earlier, the protected elastin fiber can regenerate. So that, again, is a very bird's eye view. Now, preclinical therapeutic innovation that has been successful in lab animals is a combination of a drug-filled nanoparticle or liposome, which is conjugated with an antibody that is specific for elastin fiber. This antibody was developed by Dr. Charles Rice, again, at Clemson University. He worked with Dr. Vivahari to do this, and they have published several papers on this that have shown that they were actually able to restore lung function in emphysema models, and they were able to reverse calcification in other animal models and actually restore functionality and actually reversed senescence. And for those of you who are familiar with senescence, that's quite a phenomenal thing to have senescence reversed when the cell is decalcified. So this is in the works. And the former NIH director, Dr. Francis Collins, when he saw this, he did a blog on it. And this is what he said: using these nanoparticles may enable medical treatment without requiring surgical interventions. Fixing the vessels may ultimately reverse the course of the disease. And the disease that he was talking about was cardiovascular disease. So you can see the tremendous potential of this approach. So here are some of the people that I've mentioned: Dr. Rice, Dr. Weiss, and Dr. Vivahari. I know them all. They are all brilliant, and you should watch this space because I think they're going to be doing great things. By the way, they're not the only ones, because there are at least 3 or 4 other therapies that I haven't talked about that are in earlier stages, and that's something to watch for as well. So here's some literature on clinical studies, which you can look at later. I just did these 3 because they're quite recent and there's not that much literature on it. There are thousands of published papers on Elastin, but on the clinical studies, it's still pretty sparse. And as a detail, I have written a book called Discovering the Nature of Longevity, which I believe is the first book for general audiences that actually describes what elastin is, who made the discoveries of the therapies that can actually restore it. And Dr. Gervasio Lamas at Mount Sinai Institute and Columbia University is the chief of cardiology there. He wrote the foreword to the book, and yeah, you can just have a look at it. So as disclosure, I co-founded Elastin Therapeutics, which has this preclinical method that I described, the nanoparticle conjugated with the antibody. I've been studying calcification since 2004. And when I saw Dr. Vivahari's paper in 2015, the light went on because the missing factor was elastin. And I immediately flew over and said, we need to start this up and we need to get investors involved. So that's what we're doing. And that's it. If you want to get a hold of me, you can write me at info@calcify.com. And the website is www.calcify.com, which contains a lot more information than just about elastin, but there is a nice short video on the homepage and you can have a look at that. So I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate Douglas. It's super interesting, definitely. And yeah, so thanks again for a wonderful presentation. And yeah, I'm sure that this is going to stimulate a lot of interesting conversation and consideration among audience members. I don't remember getting a lot of instruction in this area in medical school, and I think that it's surprising in some ways because obviously when you have a specific substance, all of the associated, it really affects so many different kinds of physiological systems in the body that and has such a wide-ranging effect on health that it's pretty surprising. So very interesting to learn about it, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise in presenting this, Douglas. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for having me. And that's why I say, to borrow from Sting, every move you make, every breath you take is done by elastin. Yes, and thank you again very much for having me.